Well, good morning, everyone. Is this, you hearing me okay? Okay, because it sounds a little different to me. So today is the first Sunday celebration we had since our election on Tuesday. And I think just about everybody has something that they could be upset about from that election, one way or another. But we, or as Reverend Bonnie said, was it only last week? Last week, our outer world continues to challenge our inner world. And certainly Tuesday was no exception, and its aftermath. But we have to remember that our goal is a world that works for everyone, not just a world that works for the people that voted the way we did, but a world that works for the people who voted the opposite way. Not just a world that works for people who share our particular point of view or who belong to some group we identify with, but a world that works for everyone. Now, today is Veterans Day, and as we honor the veterans who fought in past wars and current ones, I think we have to remember that they're not fighting for one group or another of Americans, but for all of us, red states and blue states. And I had this idea this morning, and I just didn't have time to do it, well, I'll get to it later. When I was growing up, my mother sometimes referred to holidays not by their current names, but by the names they had when she was growing up. So she often called Memorial Day Decoration Day, and she often referred to Veterans Day as Armistice Day, because it was originally the anniversary, and still is, of course, the anniversary of the armistice that ended World War I. In fact, that was 100 years ago today, November 11th, 1918. And it was set up, I'm going to move this a little bit so I can sit as well. It was set up in addition to honoring the veterans of World War I and other wars, to celebrate the armistice that ended those hostilities. And I think that's a good thing for us to do, to declare an armistice, to end our own political hostilities toward one another, and to remember the oneness that we have. This is a message that goes way back. George Washington talked about it in his farewell speech, to remember that we're all Americans. Now, to do that, I've thought of a couple of meditations, not for us to actually do, but that I'm going to describe. And one of them is this. It's called, the general thing that is called is a loving kindness meditation. This is not I've designed. But I wanted to go toward particular people. Loving kindness meditation is, in your meditation practice, what you do is you think of some individual and you just think of them with love and with kindness and wishing them well, wishing a world that works for them. But the individual that I'd like you to consider doing it for is someone either in office now or coming into office who you don't want to be in that office. Some winner of some race, some political race that you really have issues with them. To think of them each day with loving kindness. And I think if you do that, then things will go easier for you. And you'll spread that aura of loving kindness around to others who may pick up on it. The idea that I had this morning was this idea of the yin-yang symbol. You know, the one with the squiggly things, one's black and one's white, and the black one has a white dot in its center, and the white one has a black dot in its center. And instead, to make it red and blue. So if you can sort of meditate on that kind of a symbol, I think that would also be very helpful. Now, the theme for this month, as Reverend Bunny said, is the sacred practice of giving. And it makes me, I think, well, what is a sacred practice? What is a spiritual practice, is the way I describe it. One of my favorite books is Stranger in a Strange Land, and one of the characters in there says, if you can sing to the glory of God, you can skate to the same end. In the Bill Murray remake of The Razor's Edge, there's a character who says that when he's washing his pots and pans in the river, that's a spiritual practice for him. In the Hebrew Bible, there are 613 commandments, not 10, 613 by traditional count. And they're about every aspect of life. There are commandments about what you wear and your food and how you grow it and what you do with it. They're going into your house, coming out of your house, washing, getting rid of waste. There are commandments for everything. And I know that Paul thinks of these as 613 traps, 613 gotchas, but that's not really the way to think of them. There's 613 opportunities to practice these day-to-day acts spiritually, whether you're going into your house or coming out or etc. Now, so to have it as a sacred or spiritual practice is something I'm going to go into. But then also I want to distinguish between giving and sometimes that we use the word to give or giving when we're not actually giving anything. For instance, at the end of a meal, when you're in a restaurant, you give the waiter or the person at the counter your money or your credit card. Well, you're not giving them something. You're paying for the meal. But we'll sometimes say you're giving them the money. Or if you give your money to a stockbroker or a mutual fund, well, you're not giving anything. You're expecting a return for that money. You're investing it. And the one that kind of sneaks up on you is often you'll hear about the phrase exchanging Christmas gifts. So they're gifts, you're giving them, but you're exchanging them. I give you a gift, you give me a gift. It's not quite the same as that giving that Reverend Bonnie read about from Science of Mind magazine, where it said, the giving has no motive. It is not a give-to-get strategy. Now, I don't know how many people here have attended some sort of seminar or workshop or whatever in the idea of selling things or advertising or even promoting an idea. But what you will find in a lot of those seminars is that the instructor will say that people tend to tune in to station WIIFM. What's in it for me? And I think that when people teach about giving, if they've sort of gotten that idea that when you present any sort of idea, you have to broadcast on that WII FM station. And so you find that associated with the idea of giving in a lot of teaching is what's in it for you. And that's so ingrained that it shows up everywhere. Even though, as that reading said, the giving has no motive, it's not a give-to-get strategy. You'll see giving tied to receiving all the time in so many teachings. But if it's tied to receiving, if it's giving is about giving, it's not about receiving. If you're doing something that's also about receiving, it's one of those other things. You're paying for something or you're investing or exchanging. It's not just giving. There's an esoteric teaching that I think many of you have heard, that you give with your right hand and you receive with your left hand. But there's another teaching that says when you give, don't let your left hand know that your right hand is doing it. Don't have your left hand be expecting something to receive something because your right hand is giving something. It's just for the giving. Now, sometimes when we give something to somebody, we don't completely let go of it, right? There's a little holding on. And I want to tell you a story that one of my teachers told us a long time ago. His name was Paul Grievous in New York, G-R-I-V, not Grievous, but it's a Greek name. And this was in New York City, and he was at a friend's apartment, and he told us their names, but I don't remember them, so I'll call her Kathy. Now I'll call her Julia, make up a name. And he was in her apartment, he was admiring a lamp of hers, and she offered to give it to him. And they do that little dance that you do. Oh, no, I couldn't. Oh, please, that little dance. But eventually, he did end up accepting the lamp and brought it to his apartment. And he had it there for some time. And some time later, a friend was visiting his apartment. Let's call her, somebody tell me a name. Cindy, good. So Cindy is visiting his apartment, and she's admiring the lamp. And he's had it for a while, and he's kind of used to it, and he offers it to her, and they do the little dance, and eventually she takes it to her apartment. Little time goes by, and Cindy is throwing a party at her apartment. She invites Paul, and Paul takes whatever name I said before, Julia. He takes Julia to the party, not quite remembering that she's going to see the lamp there. So they show up at the party. And she sees the lamp, and she says to Paul, "Paul, is that my lamp?" And Paul says, No, that's not your lamp. Little time goes by, they're partying and having a good time, but she's looking at the lamp, and she comes up to Paul again, and she says, "Paul, I think that's my lamp." And Paul says, "No, that's not your lamp." A little bit more time goes by. Finally, she says, "Paul, I'm sure that's my lamp." And he says, "No, it's not your lamp. It was your lamp. Then you gave it to me, and it was my lamp. And I gave it to Cindy, and now it's Cindy's lamp. It's not your lamp." When you give something, try to remember to give it away. It's not yours anymore. Now, Reverend Bonnie spoke briefly last week about the practice of tithing. She said she thought maybe it would be the entire talk, and it was actually just a little bit of it. And I want to examine that a little bit in terms of spiritual practice. Is it a spiritual practice? What is a spiritual practice? Does how it's taught really present it as one? What do we mean when we say, as Reverend Bonnie did last week, that tithing works? Do we mean that it's tied into how you're doing in life, how you're doing financially, how you're doing in relationships or emotionally, whatever? Well, we're religious scientists. Let's look at the data. And I think when we look at the data, we realize that we all know people or have known people who tithe every week and are doing really well in all aspects of their life or in most of the aspects of their life. And we all know people who tithe religiously every week who are not doing well at all. And we all know people who have never tithed in their lives, may not even have heard of it, and are doing very well, and other people who have never tithed and are doing not well. So if we look at the data, we see there's no correlation between how you're doing and whether or not you're tithing. As religious scientists, we have to accept that data. When I was at a board meeting a few years back, some years back now, one of the board members said out loud, and I was shocked by it, "I tithed all last year, and what did I get for it?" And it sounds, but really it should not be surprising, given the way that tithing is often taught. And so I'm going to examine not the practice right now, but how it's taught. I think these teachers, quite a bit, are broadcasting on that station, WIIFM, when they teach about it. They teach it not as giving, but as an investment strategy. That's why it's in so many prosperity classes, so many prosperity books. And some of those things that they say really rub me the wrong way. Sometimes you will see in some books, they'll refer to how J.P. Morgan and Henry Ford and John D. Rockefeller, these guys all tithed, and look at how prosperous they were. And they are looking at how I want to phrase this, how they were doing, but not how they were doing it. I mean, we call these people robber barons for a reason. They were engaging in practices that were in no way spiritual. And I'm pretty sure that they did not view their giving of a tithe as giving, but as just another way of investing. And so holding these people up as examples of tithing is not teaching it as a sacred or spiritual practice. Another thing I've heard a number of times that really doesn't sit well with me is you hear people say, well, if I don't tithe, then the universe takes the money from me anyway in some unexpected expense. Have you heard people say that? Now, that bothers me for a couple of reasons. First of all, it's really not very different from, if I spill some salt and don't throw it over my shoulder, then bad things will happen to me. This is the kind of superstition that Ernest Holmes was saying exists in old religions that we really have to get rid of. We have to get rid of superstitious kind of thinking. But also, it strikes me as a kind of cosmic protection racket. You got a real nice life here. It'd be a shame if something happened to it, but you pay us our cut, we'll make sure everything goes all right. That's not sacred giving. That's paying protection money, if that's what's in your mind when you think of it. Also, another thing that I've seen in books, and I've heard at least one speaker say, is people ask, well, can I tithe to people who have needs? And they'll say, no. You have to tithe to a church. You don't tithe to people who are in need. And they'll give reasons for it. But that goes totally against, because they'll also quote a lot of Bible things, but it goes totally against the original Bible idea of a tithe. In Deuteronomy, I think it's chapter 14, is where the idea of tithing is really set out. It's referred to here and there, but in Deuteronomy it's really set out. And what are you setting aside? A tithe, ma'aser in Hebrew, is simply a tenth. That's what the word tithe means. It's just an old English word for tenth, but the King James wrote in that sort of style, and that's where we get the word. What did they tithe? What did they set aside a tenth of? The food they were growing. Farmers and ranchers, set aside a tenth of the grain you're growing, of the olive oil, of things like that, your flocks and your herds. And I was looking at a website. Well, let me back up a little bit for that. What did you do with that tenth that you were putting aside? You went up to Jerusalem and you had a feast. You, the tither, ate the food that you were reserving. It didn't go to somebody else. It was a way to have a spiritual, because you were in the presence of the God of Israel, a spiritual feast. And so you set that particular food aside for that feast. And since it's the food you grow, I looked at a website that talked about tithing, and he talked about all the other people besides farmers and ranchers in biblical Israel. And I'll give you, there were bakers, carpenters, he says, hired workers, craftsmen, musicians, painters, sculptors, physicians, soldiers, teachers. And none of these professions or the products of them are included in a tithe. It's just about food. It's just about food. Now, I said you went up to Jerusalem and you had a feast, a festival, a party. But every third year, you didn't do that. You took that tenth part of what you were growing and you gave it to those in need. Exactly the opposite of what these teachers are teaching. You gave it to the widows and the orphans in your community, the fatherless, the people who had no land to grow things on, and the alien living in your community. That's who got your tithe 1 year in 3. They'll also point to a particular passage in the book of Malachi, or Malachi is the way you say it in English, I guess. In chapter 3, verse 10, it talks about bring your tithe to the storehouse, and there's a whole lot of background that they don't understand or talk about that. But in addition, just a few verses before, Malachi talks about any sort of tithe. It's all about Israel returning to the teachings of God. And before he talks about a tithe at all, he again talks about caring for the widow, for the orphan and the fatherless, for the alien in your midst, and for your workers. And then he goes on to talk about the tithe that a specific group gives into the storehouse, not everybody. And I think if you don't do that, if you don't care for the homeless, the needy, the aliens, and your workers and so on, you're not really tithing, no matter how much money you might give to a church. You're not doing it as a spiritual practice then. So, am I telling you not to tithe? Of course not. That's not what I'm saying at all. I'm saying you want to do it as a sacred and spiritual practice of giving. A lot of people think that it's part of the science of mind teaching to tithe. Well, not according to Ernest Holmes. I think most of you know that in Science of Mind magazine, Jesse Jennings has been doing this Q&A column forever. And some years back, someone asked him about tithing, and here's part of what he wrote about that. He said, on the subject of tithing, Holmes may have said something at some time to somebody, but he never wrote a published word about it. In the Basic Ideas of Science of Mind, he did say this: there are hundreds of great needs in the world today where every dollar you can spare, and as Reverend Bonnie said, dollar you can spare, not to hurt yourself by giving, every dollar you can spare will serve some worthy purpose. When you intelligently and generously give from what you have for the good of others, you may depend on it, and here he starts broadcasting on that channel, that you will have a spiritual response and concrete good will come rushing back to fill that empty space. Jennings goes on, however, he does not cite any percentage as being more intelligent and generous than another. And Jennings concludes, many religious scientists tithe. Most of us do not believe in a God who calculates acceptability by percentages. So you can choose to have tithing as your practice, or you can choose some other practice for giving. But will it be a spiritual practice? Will you do it spiritually and not religiously? Or mechanically, as the reading said, to just mechanically think it's some sort of law, some sort of rule. It's about your consciousness. It's not about some rule. One time when Doug and Tina Bailey were up here and talking about their practice of tithing, I remember that they said that there was a period where they were going through some tough times, and they decided to increase what they gave to 12% from 10%. Now, if 10% were some sort of magic number, there'd be no point to that. But they understood it's not about some number, it's about your consciousness. Indeed, that's what the biblical tithe was for. The farmers back then, as farmers most places and most times, had that day-to-day struggle to make ends meet. And yet they learned that even then, they could put aside a tenth of what they were growing and still get by, still do all right. And then that tenth, they could either have a party, have a really good time with, to get them out of their day-to-day, or give to those who needed it even more. They were learning to have that sort of consciousness. So If you choose to practice sacred giving here, let's say, when you give your gift into the collection plate, if you want to do it as giving, doing without expecting anything in return. So it's not your investment, you're giving. And just as with singing or skating or washing the dishes or anything else, if you practice it spiritually, then it's a spiritual practice. And so it is.